Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I'm Christian Bellotti. I'm with the Extreme Computing Group. I'm the Director of Hardware Architecture there, here in MSR. It's a real honor for me to introduce my friend and colleague in the industry, Jonathan Koomey. And let me give you a little of his background. John is a consulting professor at Stanford, and he has recently been a visiting professor at Yale and Stanford. He worked at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory for almost 2 decades. He is, and for those of you who are in this industry know that he is a leading international expert on the economics of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the effects of information technology on resource use. He holds an MS and PhD degree in energy and resource, or from the Energy and Resource Group of UC Berkeley, and an AB in the History of Science from Harvard University. He's authored or co-authored 8 books and has over 150 articles and reports. He's, of course, also very involved with the EPA and the DOE at many levels. Again, it's a real pleasure to have him speak to our group here. So, John?
Thanks very much, Christian. Okay, so can everyone hear me? Sound is good? Okay. So I'm going to talk to you today about long-term trends in the efficiency of computing. And by long-term, I mean longer than Moore's Law. I'm going to talk to you about something that is inherent in the nature of electronic computation. And it's been going on since ENIAC. And I'm going to describe to you some measured data that I use to understand those trends. So first, before we go any further, I want to thank Rob Berard of Microsoft, Lori Weigel of Intel for co-funding this work. Stephen Berard is co-author. Marla Sanchez of LBL and Carnegie Mellon, and Henry Wong of Intel also co-authors. So by way of background, most of you know this, but let's just summarize. This is from work I did in 2008 summarizing total power used by data centers in the world. And what you see here is electricity use in billion kilowatt hours per year, 2000 and 2005. You see roughly a doubling over that 5-year period. And you see volume servers being the bulk of that growth for data centers. But the main point is that for many different kinds of IT equipment, you see vast increases in penetration of the equipment, as well as increases in total power use by the equipment. Question, or were you just scratching your ear? Okay. So we know that IT services are going up. The delivery of those services are increasing rapidly because of voice over IP, because of video over the internet, because of computations, because of Sarbanes-Oxley, because of all sorts of other things. So that pushes up the demand for the equipment that delivers IT services. At the same time, IT is becoming energy efficient. If you define efficiency as what you're doing, what service you're delivering divided by the amount of electricity it takes to deliver that service, IT is becoming energy efficient at a furious pace. So the research question here is there some regularity in the long-term trends around the efficiency of computation? So I'm going to start with the key result here. Computations per kilowatt hour, the number of computations you can do per kilowatt hour consumed, has doubled roughly every year and a half for the last 60 plus years. That's the big result from this study. Now there are implications of that we'll talk about that I think are important for the people in this room in terms of anticipating future developments on mobile computing, on mobile sensors and controls. We'll talk more about that later on in the talk. So we all know about Moore's Law. It's not a law in the physical sense, but it's a description, an empirical observation about the economics of chip production related to the number of components per chip. And back in 1965, in the first paper on this, Moore talked about doubling every year, and he talked about density of components. Didn't even talk about transistors specifically, he just said density of components. So I think first he was looking at memory chips. But by 1975, things had changed a little bit, and he modified the law to say every 2 years, doubling every 2 years. It characterizes this economics of chip production, as I said. It's often imprecisely cited, and you hear people talking about Moore's law being performance doubling every year and a half. Well, that turns out to be true in the PC era. Performance per computer doubles every year and a half. But Moore never said that. He looked at the density of chips, and that was where the law came from. There's a great historical review by Moloch that talks about the various interpretations that people have had over this over time. So here's the original graph from the 1965 paper, and what you see is here's relative manufacturing cost per component, and here's number of components per integrated circuit. At any point in time, there's a curve that characterizes the relationship there, and the minimum of these curves is where you want to be, and this is his doubling every year or so. That's how we calculated that. So, question? Yes, question.
If you multiply the cost per component by the number of components, can you find more second law in this first chart?
That's a good question.
It goes up and the dollar cost goes way up.
I don't know the answer to that, but it's a good question. Let's talk about it afterwards. This is not something I've thought about. Okay, so this is from some data from Jim Laras here at Microsoft, but this is a familiar chart, right? Transistors per chip. At some point, Intel got a hold of this, of course, and started turning it into transistors per chip, which turns out to also be true. But it was a jump from the components per chip from Moore's original work. So doubling from 71 to 2006, for microprocessors, the doubling time is about every 1.8 years using this data set. So as Christian knows, and some of you know, I've done a lot of work on data centers and servers and trying to understand the costs and energy use and performance trends over time in those facilities. And I had done this work in part with Christian and with others here and at Intel, looking at those trends where I actually found different examples of servers that were comparable in terms of where they were in the marketplace over time, and then measured those trends over time to understand what was actually happening there. Well, my initial thought for this general look at computation was to do a similar sort of thing, but I discovered a paper by Bill Nordhaus at Yale. Now, for those of you who know about climate change, Bill Nordhaus is kind of the dean of the climate economists. People have been studying this topic for a long time. But he actually has some interesting hobbies, and one of them is the history of computing. And so he did a beautiful study looking, going all the way back to the hand calculations and the abacus of how long it took to perform various tasks, and then what the cost was to perform various computing tasks. So he looked at cost and performance, and it turns out finding his normalized performance data over time was instrumental in helping me do the work that I'm going to describe to you here. Instead of looking at costs, I said, well, he's already done that. Let's look at energy and performance and see if there's some relationship. So the first graph, before I knew about Nordhaus, was this calculations per second per dollar of purchase cost. And I plotted some familiar computers there. So here's ENIAC, 1946, IBM PC, XT, AT. Here are a couple of desktops and laptops that I happen to have at my house. And again, very rough calculations, right? This is the exploratory phase. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Yes, it's a semi-lag plot, but boy, does that look like a straight line? Yes, it does. Then I've made this one, which was computations per kilowatt hour, same basic relationship. And I thought, that's interesting. I'll keep digging on this. And then I made this graph. And this was adding some data that came from folks at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, the supercomputing folks. NERSC is, I don't know what the acronym stands for, but they're the big supercomputers at LBL over time. This is the original Cray 1. And then you have these other. And I said, that's starting to look like a real relationship there. I better investigate further. Now, it turns out I ended up not using the NERSC data in this study. And the reason is that these are estimated power numbers, not measured. So for every data point you see, I have measured power. And so for these, I just threw them out. They got me to think about it and do the measurements, but I just threw them out because they weren't measured. And I keep bugging the LBL guys to measure their computers, and they're not doing it for me. So the basic method here is to focus on computations. Now, computations, as Nordhaus defined them, he looked back at the history of computing, and there were a number of people, including MooreGÇÖS and Knight and a few others, who actually looked at different kinds of computers and came up with a standard suite of operations, and then tried to understand how the time trends happened with a variety of different kinds of computers using the standard set of operations. So basically creating very primitive benchmarks that they carry out over time. Now, we all know that if you get 10 computer scientists in a room, they're all going to have a different way to measure performance, and there's going to be all these arguments. But for this kind of broad sweep of historical trends, we don't have to worry about that quite so much. And I think Nordhaus did a very careful job at melding those data. So I used those estimates of the performance, and this is maximum performance, full load, the computer operating full out for 1 hour, divided by the measured electricity consumption per hour, also operating at full load. Question?
Is this theoretical performance or actually running some code?
This is, I think, theoretical performance.
SAE.
Yeah, and so what I actually, I have some data here where I had this thing that Intel calls composite theoretical performance. I actually have that as well as some real benchmarks for certain of the machines. And it turned out that the results were only different by 10 or 15% in terms of the trend. So it was, it's a good question, but it turns out for this application didn't make that much of a difference. So that's what we're trying to calculate here. And so the performance data comes from the Nordhaus study where he had looked at hundreds of different kinds of computers. When I didn't have performance data for certain computers, but I had measured power data, I normalized the performance data using various benchmarks to get something that was comparable to the Nordhaus time series. And then on the power side, I used measured power data, either published data. Now, there's this great source that the people at the Computer History Museum in San Jose put me onto. This guy Wyke, I think is how you pronounce it, back in the 50s and 60s, he surveyed all the computers that existed. And that was back when you could, right? And the military, it was the Office of Naval Research and some of the other military folks, they wanted to understand the different capabilities of all the computers out there. So they actually had power data for certain of the machines in their publications. But for others, there was historical data that the LBL folks had done. There's stuff that my group at LBL had done more recently. I also dug around in other places, and I'll describe that in a second. So to the extent that we could set this, we calculated or measured the power use with the computer fully utilized. That's the focus, full power, full utilization. And then whenever there was a portal, there's a few portables in there, and you'll see a picture in a second of something that will look familiar to some of you, to look archaic to others. But we subtracted out the screen power, so we wanted just the box power. So just an aside, and again to satisfy the people who are purists on this, we know that performance trends with real software are not the same thing as performance trends from benchmarks, and they're not the same thing as transistor trends. So you have to make that distinction, and we're focused here. I've been warned to use this very powerful laser so that we can see it on the screen there. This is what we're focused on here, really, performance trends from benchmarks. So in the PC era, from Nordhaus's data, you see the doubling time for performance per computer is every 1.5 years. So that kind of corresponds with this informal or imprecise interpretation of Moore's Law. It turns out to be a true statement, doubling of performance per computer every year and a half. And here's a graph of performance per computer. Now, just to be clear, we've got many different kinds of computers here. So we've got the Cray 1, we've got this Cray, we've got this new Silicon Cortex machine, Green Destiny, and then there's a bunch of PCs down here. So a huge variation in terms of the actual amount of computing power per device. But you still see a pretty clear trend here. So in order to measure the power use, I actually came to visit. You guys have this wonderful archive. I don't know if all of you know about it, but it's a beautiful archive. It's temperature controlled, humidity controlled, and they have all these old computers with the original disks, all in bootable condition. So they just pulled out computer after computer, and I had my meter, and I spent the afternoon just metering old computers. LBL had some more recent machines that I climbed under various desks to measure those. My in-laws, they're photographers, so they had a few powerful computers that I measured. And then Eric Klein, I'll show you some photos in a bit. This is a guy in San Jose his hobby is old computers. He's got a whole garage filled with old computers, and his wife must be a very patient woman. He's a very nice man, and he was very helpful. And then the Computer History Museum turned out to be very helpful as well, particularly for these computers that have vacuum tubes. They predated me, so I didn't know the mechanics or the electronics of it, and there were a few people, including Ed Thelen, who were very helpful in helping me understand those computers. So anyone know what this is? Look familiar? Altair 8800. So this was the computer that appeared on the cover of Popular Electronics. It was a kit, 1975. And so it was a sensation because it appeared on Popular Electronics, and suddenly thousands of people wanted one. And so it became this thing. It was really the first widely, if you can use tens of thousands as widely owned, personal computers. This is from Eric's computer archives. Anyone recognize this one? Yeah. Yep. And then this one is obvious. And then here's Eric. So I found a lot of old machines and did a lot of measurements. So here's the summary graph that shows the various data points that I had, both performance and energy use. This is computations per kilowatt hour, and here's this is about 1,000. This is 1,000 here. So ENIAC is just under 1,000 computations per kilowatt hour. At the high end here, we're up at about 10 to the 15th computations per kilowatt hour by the end here. So here's the vacuum tube era till about 1958. It was a very rapid transition of only a few years because it was so clear that the transistors were both more reliable and more cost efficient that there was this quick changeover to transistors. For a while there were some machines that had both, but it just took a few years and then it was all transistors. So you see there's actually this big jump here, and the kind of rule of thumb was that there was a factor of 10 difference in terms of energy use per switch going to the transistor from the tube. But this is more than a factor of 10 here. This is more like a factor of 100. And so what I think was going on was that there was tremendous innovation in using this new set of switches, this new type of switches, and figuring out better ways to interconnect them to make things work more efficiently. And so this range, I think, reflects that rate of innovation. I don't have a lot of computers in the discrete transistor era. There's a few. There's a couple of PDPs in there. Gordon Bell, who's in your research group, I think he's in San Francisco, helped me with some of the data for those. And then here's the PC era, starting here. So there's the Altair, Apple II, IBM, and it's a pretty striking correlation. Now I had one of my college roommates is Eric Brynjolfsson at MIT. He's a specialist in the economics of information technology, and he was good enough to look over the regressions just to make sure that I'd done my calculations correctly. He said, "Yep, looks good, and I sure wish my regressions looked like that." So here's PCs only, starting in 1975. You can see a little more detail here. And so here's some interesting things you see is that this was PS2 where they actually used laptop chips. And so it's above the line, but not hugely. And it soon, because of the rate of these performance trends, soon surpassed by computers that were much more powerful. But again, basically the same trend. We have very nice R squared, 0.98, 0.97 for PCs, doubling times for all computers over the whole period, 1.6 years for PCs, every 1.5 years, vacuum tubes every 1.35 years. So things actually improved more rapidly during the vacuum tube era than in the PC era. And we saw that big jump from tubes to transistors. Now recall that the performance per PCs was also doubling every 1.5 years. So there's a relationship there. So actions taken to improve performance invariably improve computations per kilowatt hour. So this is an inherent trend in information technology. It's not just that we happen to be able to build things more efficiently because we're more clever. It's that if you want to have higher performance transistor-based or electronic-based machines, that you will improve computations per kilowatt hour. For transistors, that means that you shrink them, you have a shorter distance from the source to the drain, you have fewer electrons in the transistor. For tubes, you have smaller tubes, you have lower capacitance, and these are all things that do both. They improve performance and improve efficiency. And the key implication here is that these trends actually make mobile and distributed computing ever more feasible. Basically, at constant computing power, the battery life doubles every 1.5 years. If you can go the other way. If you think about it in terms of laptops, you can have performance increasing every year and doubling every 1.5 years for constant battery life. So that's the big implication of this research. And you see that in what's happening now. For the first time in 2009, IDC data shows that laptops surpass desktops in terms of annual sales. First time. So this is installed base that I'm showing here. Okay, so installed base, millions of computers, starting back in '85, not so many. I didn't have data splitting out the laptops. There were very few there. Weren't really laptops, really. They were luggables. But here's installed base, and you see by 2008, laptops are something like 1/3. But in terms of sales, in 2009, laptops there were more units sold. And so these trends that I described enabled this to happen, this takeover of the laptops. Now here's another example that I like to use. It's called the Big Belly Trash Compactor. It's used by people who run parks, public works departments. And it does a number of different things. It has a compactor, so it actually compacts the trash factor of 5. So that you save the number of trips right there. You don't have the big truck coming around. But also it uses IT, and it sends a text message when it's full. So there's a sensor in there. It says, how much do I have? I'm full. Come and get me. So it's more than a factor of 5 improvement. It's a factor of 10 or 20. It uses ambient light. It's got a photovoltaic panel, and it's just this is a prime example of moving bits, not atoms, and it's a way to achieve very substantial environmental performance improvements using IT. Another example that I like to think about is, what if we had a laptop that had kind of modern capabilities, but just used ambient light? Now, I'm not talking about putting it in the sun. I'm talking about using ambient light. And when I talk to folks like you, I want to put this out there as a challenge, because we're not close to this yet, but the trends that I described will eventually make this possible. Plus, you have to have improvements in batteries, you have to have improvements in the screen, there's other things you have to do. But ultimately, you can imagine this becoming possible. And that's a laptop that you never need to plug in. That would be a game changer. So it's really, Amory Levins at Rocky Mountain Institute likes to talk about whole system redesign, how you get to these kind of big game-changing improvements, looking at the whole system again, reevaluating and redesigning it to make it do something amazing. Yes, you had the question first.
Past to predict the future?
Well,
just because we've seen this happen the last 30 years doesn't necessarily mean it's going to continue to happen.
Of course, that's true. But certainly for the next 5 or 10 years, the Intel folks say, we've got you covered. Now, they always say that. And they always figure out something 10 years from now to make. So I agree with your skepticism up to a point. Well, no, every 10 years or 5 years they say that, and every 5 years they figure out another way. So the point is, if you continue to improve transistor density and improve performance of these machines, that you will further enable more and more mobile sensors, more mobile controls, and mobile computing. Okay. So there are.
I'm sure you get all that.
Sure. But the point is that, certainly for the next 5 or 10 years, you'll give me that this is going to go, right? This will be fine. Now, whether they can do more than that, they always seem to figure it out. I don't know if they will.
So is 5 years enough to get ambient light machines?
Probably not.
Okay.
But the point is to think about a different way to create a device that does things that you didn't imagine before. You can imagine, if these trends do continue, and I think 60 years of history is a strong argument that they may, then there's the possibility of creating such a thing. And so, again, you'll have to talk to the Intel guys about what's happening next up, because I'm not privy to what's deep down going in their design shop. But publicly they say 5 or 10 years, no problem, probably longer. I think you're next in the back here.
So I'm just trying to reconcile what you're telling me with the other data I hear about.
Okay.
So my understanding is that power consumption in these chips has steadily increased. On the other hand, you're telling me that the computational efficiency per power unit
is
going up also.
So let me just be precise. So you're saying that per chip itself, the power use is going up.
That's right.
And over what time period?
So I don't know. So
let's just say the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So what's been happening, once the megahertz wars kind of came to an end, they started moving to multiple cores and doing chips that kept within the same power envelope but had many more cores. So the physical power use per chip actually wasn't increasing. Certainly they were putting on other additional chips and doing other things in the boxes, putting 2 processors and so on. But certainly in the recent past, that hasn't been happening. Now that requires the software folks to actually change what they're doing if you're going to capture those performance improvements, which is a change from what went before.
Let's say that I was also wondering what you call a performance improvement. Let's say I figure out I just keep packing more and more cores on a machine, and I have no idea how the hell I'm going to use those cores. Does that count as performance improvement in your?
Well, for the purposes of these measurements, yes, but that just puts the onus on the people doing the programming to redesign their software to take advantage of that performance. And this was this is a qualitative difference from the previous 30 years, because suddenly you used to rely on the transistor trends. You could just use the same code, right, and just rely on the transistor trends to improve performance. Well, now the software designers have to really get into the act if you're going to capture that performance, and that's a quantum shift. It's a difference in thinking about that. I think you were next here.
Before you go for the no plug-in laptop, how realistic is a no plug-in Kindle?
Probably pretty realistic. Yeah. But so I'm not saying this is immediately going to happen. I'm saying here's an idea that if these trends continue, you could imagine being possible. So there are people who are way smarter than me about gadgets who may be able to figure out how to do this in 5 years. And I just want to get people starting to think about it, because I think that this is these trends are something.
In addition, solar cells will also improve, right?
Right. So you get improvements in the efficiency of solar cells and the efficiency of batteries and so on. There's a guy in the back here who's next.
Maybe it's a rabbit trail, but have you done have you looked into memristors? And where does that fit into your research?
I actually have not.
Okay.
So do you know something about them that you can share, or is it?
Well, I think it's more theoretical right now, but yeah, basically it's like a transistor, except it remembers its last state without power. So it means you press the power button on your computer and it's there. It doesn't
Right.
boot
So it's
up.
like a flash. It's like flash RAM, or it's
Exactly.
this kind of thing. Yeah.
Or yeah.
Yeah. So you can imagine. I mean, certainly you're seeing that in phones and other mobile devices. The shift away from this from RAM that has to be refreshed.
Right.
And so that changes things as well. I think the screen is the biggest constraint. You figure out a way to make that a lot more efficient, and maybe even do dual duty as collecting light while it's generating, putting out light. I don't know, but again, there are people who are much smarter than me about semiconductors who may be able to make this happen. I just want to put this out there as an idea for someone to start thinking about it. Was there a question over?
I was just going to make a point about the no plug-in Kindle. You're already seeing some of these things in peripheral devices. Logitech actually has a wireless keyboard now, entirely powered by solar. So you never plug that in. Now, granted, the keyboard is much less demanding than a PC, but you can see like maybe a Kindle, which is a fairly low-powered device, may actually get to that as solar cells.
They have some calculators.
Yep. From the old days.
Unless you have a really large graphing calculator, you don't need batteries these days.
So
that's true too.
The most exciting thing to me, though, is these wireless sensors. So you have these folks at Berkeley, they call them the MOTES, where they make very small battery-powered wireless sensors, and then they're cheap, so you can sprinkle them around your data center or some other place. You're starting to see these pop up, but you can imagine many, many more applications where you'll be able to do this, partly because of the trends that I've described. Now, this does not deal with the power use in idle modes, right? This is just maximum. So for many of these devices, they're idle a lot of the time. And so combined with these trends, you also have to be clever about the creation of these idle modes to reduce power use when they're not operating. And so there's been a lot of, driven by Energy Star and other programs, there's been a lot of interest in this. But it's more than just this trend. You also have to do these other smart things in terms of the operation of the machines. But the wireless sensors, to me, are kind of the archetype of what's most exciting about this, because suddenly we'll be able to collect data in real time in a way that will allow us to respond to reality in ways that we never could before. And that, to me, is very exciting. It's getting closer and closer to the idea that we're delivering energy services as they're needed, in the place that they're needed, in the amount that they're needed, instead of turning on the light switch, leaving it on. When you leave the room, it should shut off. There should be more and more of this kind of direct control of energy service that's related to our direct need, as opposed to simply the constraints that are imposed on us by a 50 or 100-year-old electricity technology. So implications. The physicist Feynman talked about ultimate limits. Back in 85, he had a nice essay on this. And he said in 85 that there was still at least a factor of 11 potential, 10 to the 11th potential in terms of improving the efficiency of electronic computing. So this gets at your question, actually, because, and this is part of the reason why I'm optimistic about this, I also think the Intel guys are very clever. But this factor of 10 to the 11th is kind of the theoretical potential that he calculated. I can use the data that I just showed you to show, well, what has been the actual progress in the last, since 1985. Well, whoops, that progress is less than 10 to the 5th in terms of computations per kilowatt hour over this period. So I think, theoretically at least, there's reason to believe that there's headroom here. There's a long way to go before we get to Feynman's theoretical limits. Now, we don't know exactly how to get there, but we know that Feynman is one of the smartest physicists around ever, so this is probably the right number. So assuming these trends in the chips continue for the next 5 to 10 years, we've still got some efficiency improvements still to come. But I would say this, the difference between the factor of 10 to the 11th and the actual improvements that we've seen indicates that there's probably more headroom there for us to operate.
You're showing a million to one potential improvement until you hit Feynman. And
yes.
On the previous slide, there's been a trillion to one improvement from ENIAC to the present day. So it looks like on a log scale, we are 2/3 of the way to the limit.
Well, he was doing the limit compared to current practice in 1985.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, that's right. 2/3.
I'm dividing 10.
Yeah, got it.
It's
Okay.
a million to one.
Yep.
And you had a trillion to one
Yep.
on the previous graph.
Yep, got it. Yeah, so we're 2/3 of the way, so we've still got a good way to go there. So other questions on this? Okay, so there's various ways to go with this. There are only a small number of laptops in the data set. There's other kinds of computing devices, PDAs, perhaps game consoles. There are complexities, though, because defining what a computation is hard for some of these other devices. And some of them also do data transmission. That's a big part of what they do, right? So the service being delivered by some of these devices is very different. So you can't necessarily easily put them into this framework. So I haven't worked that out yet. I am curious to see how these trends might be different in different kinds of computers. And right now, this data set is not large enough to really figure that out. But looking at mainframes, PCs, laptops, servers would be an interesting way to split this out. Looking also at active and standby power to see, this is trends in active power, how have trends in standby power been affected by this over time? Yes?
Does architecture matter? I mean, I noticed that the Crays seemed like they were a little bit of an outlier, but like GPUs today versus PCs, I mean, it seems like it's a whole different.
Yeah, architecture
I had just
definitely
assumed
matters.
that it really didn't matter that much.
Well, it matters in terms of the relationship between the hardware and the software. Because you have to, if the architecture is very different, that means you're much more reliant on the software folks to deliver the actual performance improvements.
Well, the one thing that's true about GPUs is that no matter how many cores you give me, I will use them. You know, I can use them now. So it does, you know, and that will continue forever.
The demand, you're saying.
Well, and for 50 years.
Yeah.
Not for you.
Okay, so another question here that I've been thinking about is there are all these low-end chips, embedded chips. I mean, I think when I took electronics in college, that we still were using the Z80, and but there's still chips like that out there that are being sold, right? And they're used for these embedded applications. So the question is, how have these trends at all affected any of those lower-end chips, or are those just the same as they've been back, you know, when they were first created? I don't know the answer to that, but there are a lot of these embedded chips, and understanding the trends in those chips, I think, is important compared to the kind of high-end chips that we're seeing in these various computers. And then there's always this question of real-world versus benchmarks. Now, this is the megahertz wars slide. So you have the transistors over time here. We saw that graph earlier. Here's clock speed. But here you start to see something interesting here, and this is where the megahertz wars ended. And you've got, this is spec-int are the dots here, and then here's megahertz trending down. So this is kind of archetypal of what's happening here with the use of cores. And you're really seeing this shift towards other ways to get performance improvements. Now, eventually, they're going to have to come up with some other clever thing that this is going to continue. So here are a couple of big unanswered questions that I'm still thinking about. One of them is, are there any innovations that we can imagine, either hardware or software, that could allow us to exceed this historical trend? Is this something that's kind of, you know, writ in stone, or is it something where we could actually do better than this? Could we improve the performance per watt faster than we improve performance per computer? And then on the other side, what roadblocks might prevent these trends from continuing? What might get in the way of actually improving computations per kilowatt after the current pipeline of innovation is exhausted? Good things to think about. So let me just wrap up. So we have some time for questions. Quantitative results in the PC era performance per computer and computations per kilowatt hour doubled every year and a half. So that's a big picture summary. From ENIAC to the present, computations per kilowatt hour doubled every 1.6 years. So it appears that these trends are inherent in electronic information technology. And that there's an inherent link between the things we do to improve performance and the things we do to improve the efficiency of computing. We're very far, if Feynman was right, we're very far from the theoretical limits, which gives us some idea that we have a ways to go in improving the efficiency of computing. And the big picture implications here relate to the title of the talk, which is, I think we have a long way to go before we've reached these limits, and that means more and more mobile sensors, mobile controls, mobile devices, battery-powered, that will change the way we deliver IT services and change the way we deliver energy services. So with that, I will end. I have a couple of pages of references. I assume this stuff can be posted. Christian, do you know if it'll get?
I think so.
Okay, so we'll post it on the website. But with that, I will be happy to take any other questions. Yes, in the back.
This is more of a comment than a question, but so I think about what would improve my experience on a mobile computer, say my cell phone, right? And computations per energy is one way of improving it. But then wireless bandwidth is another thing that might limit my experience, or storage capacity.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, maybe we're going to hit limits on those other experience-enhancing technologies before we hit limits on computation.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you, and this is actually a very good line of thinking, because if we're going to think about limits, this is one set of limits, and you've pointed out some other ones. It relates to this problem of trying to figure out what computations really means for these devices, because they do many different things. The transmission function of data is much more integral to them than the computation function, really. And so I don't have a good answer for you. I just think it's a great question. It's something that, again, somebody who was smart about technology and thinking hard about limits in 5 or 10 years should ask that question and start to noodle on it and see if there are roadblocks you can anticipate, things you could potentially get around, because I think it's a fruitful path for inquiry. Other questions? Christian?
I know the answer, but I'm setting you up.
Are you a lawyer?
So how come with all this incredible increase in power, how come we don't see fewer computers?
Wait, I don't understand.
So this incredible increase in computational power, why isn't the power footprint going down? First graph.
You mean the total power use? Why isn't that going down? Because the demand for IT services is going up more and more rapidly. Now, that was data centers. So first of all, that was 2000 to 2005 because of the economic downturn, and we know this from the IDC data, that growth, it didn't double to 2010. It's more like a 20 to 25% increase. So that slowed down a bit. For PCs, it's a more complex picture, because you have a lot more PCs, but you also have a lot more laptops. You have a lot more, LCD screens have pretty much pushed out the old CRTs, and now you have LCD screens that have LEDs behind them instead of fluorescents that are also improving their efficiency. So you have, on the PC side, it's not clear where this is going, right? Because there have been great improvements on certain parts of the system. There are a lot more of these devices, and no one's done a careful accounting recently. The last, kind of global accounting of IT electricity use was really back in 2000. So so for certain kinds of devices that are shifting more into this mobile frame, the growth isn't like that. But the basic idea that you're getting at is that there's this massive growth in the use of these devices, and that puts pressure on total power use. And it also forces us, I think, to think about the bigger picture, which is these devices allow us to do things in the society that we couldn't do otherwise. And they allow us by moving bits instead of atoms, we can reduce our environmental impacts in other parts of the society. We can restructure our companies to make them more efficient. We can use music downloads instead of sending CDs. by the mail. We can telecommute. We can, video conference to India, so I don't have to move my atoms over there. It's a brutal trip. So there's many different ways that this use of IT allows us to do more. And so you can't just think about the direct power use. From an environmental perspective, you have to think about the bigger picture here. And the bigger picture is that IT allows you to do things in terms of controls and sensing that you couldn't do without it. So I tend to think of IT electricity use as a pretty good use of that few percent of world electricity use, because it has this potential benefit of reducing, improving efficiency and reducing emissions in the other 97% of the electricity.
I guess my point was that the cost of computation is going down.
Yes.
Also, which was the other paper you were in.
Yeah, the Nordhaus paper.
Nordhaus paper, right. And so as a result, it's fueling even more demand, right?
Well, demand for IT, but again, if you look at this bigger picture, that's transforming the broader society and helping us be more efficient generally.
Oh, yeah, I get it.
Okay.
And I support that.
Okay, good. I know you do. Yes.
So this question isn't really related so much to what you talked about, but more prompted by some of the things you said about your background. And I haven't had a newspaper subscription in about 10 years. And it seems like kind of a no-brainer that, to get your news fed by the internet and read on your screen that takes power and all of that, and all of the infrastructure it takes to deliver those electrons and bytes into my screen. But that's just way better than cutting down trees and making paper and printing. I mean, is that really true? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's entirely obvious that that's true. I mean, once you have the newspaper, you're not static, so you're not generating any, any more power to do.
So the people who have studied this are the experts in life cycle assessment. And there's folks at University of Michigan who have looked at this, some folks at Carnegie Mellon, and there are cases where it's not better to use electrons, but in most cases it's better. And so for downloading music, for sure, and probably for I don't have the latest study on the newspapers in my brain right now, but for those cases, I'm almost certain that's a win, because what you're talking about, there's this whole infrastructure of people who drive around. They drive a 3,000-pound vehicle around throwing newspapers on the.
For me personally, it's that I don't, well, there's two things. One is I don't fill my recycle bin full of stuff, which is a hassle to deal with the old newspapers. And the other one is just the fact that it's printed on paper makes it obsolete, right? It's like, yes. I could be reading the New York Times online and suddenly the page refreshes and there's a story that just happened 5 minutes ago.
Right. So there is a relationship between the kind of density of data that you need for some service and the electricity intensity of the internet. And the way that we've thought about this in the past is looking at the number of kilowatt hours per gigabyte, kilowatt hours used per gigabyte transfer, or the other way, gigabytes per kilowatt hour. And what you find is that for things that are very high information density, like certain Blu-ray discs, it's actually probably better to ship those. Right? Because you still have these services of backups where a big truck comes, right? And you have all your backup tapes and they get put in the truck and shipped off to the place, right? So if the density of data needed is high enough, then the electricity used for the download is too much, right? But if it's a small enough density, like a music CD or probably a newspaper, it's probably better.
South Africa, somewhere where they did the carrier pigeon versus the...
And in Britain.
Yeah. Carrier pigeon, when did they do this?
This was a few months ago. Or something that there was a study where some data center raced against the pigeon. I don't remember the details. but based on...
USB stick.
Well, how fast can the pigeon add? That's what I want to know.
No, it's just moving the bit.
It's moving the bit.
Yeah, it just started.
The pigeon had
USB stick.
I would add, Charles lives not far away from me, and I'll give him a two-word answer: power cut.
Power cut?
Power cut.
Pigeon wings.
We had a 4-day power cut.
Oh, I see.
Where we live. Where either you would read by candlelight or flashlight, or you wouldn't read.
Yeah.
So maybe 3 days for you. You live a little bit further north.
At that time, I was living in the north end in an apartment.
So going back to
good for you.
Christian's question. So there's definitely
some computer users which seem to be bottomless consumers of computer power. You know, a hedge fund in Wall Street, you cannot give them too much accuracy. Weather forecasting looks like being another thing. Computer graphics for games seems to be another thing. Like it's only going to be more realistic the more you can throw it. So the question is, in addition to things like that, and oh look, we have this power, now it's possible to do. Do you think that, what do you think the curve looks like for computer use in the future? Like IT power consumption, is it you know, exponentially up? Is it leveling off? Is it flat? Is it?
Well, I think historically the demand for this has grown. As soon as it becomes available, people start using it. But you do start to see where you're saturating for certain kinds of users. And I'd be curious to know if anyone here knows of people who have studied the kinds of uses that computation is being put to, and which ones are saturating and which ones aren't. Because certainly, as you know, my parents, you know, buying a laptop, they're not using the bulk of the power of that machine, right? Most people now at home, they don't need the latest and greatest, right? And so, but for these other uses that you've talked about, you absolutely need that. And so I think we need to think about the kinds of information that are being produced. And there's folks, I think, at UC San Diego, Jim Short, and some other folks are thinking about that.
Because you talk about, you know, somebody gets a laptop and they really just use it for email. Well, 5 years ago, you wouldn't have just kept 1,000, 10,000 emails in your inbox, because it would have been unmanageable. But all of a sudden, with the lovely quick search we have now, it's not. So even with like a simple task like email, there's things like that which drive, oh, we have all this power, woof, instant search, bang, done, log it.
Search.
So it's kind of, I mean, apart from like whole areas, I guess.
So I think you're getting at a really key area, which is understanding how people, the kinds of tasks people are actually doing, and figuring out which of those are saturating and which of those are just, you know, insatiable demands for computation.
Because it makes me realize what you're saying is the efficiency of computation is allowing us to be inefficient.
Yes. Yep. Certainly me, yeah.
That's actually, I never thought of that, but that's really interesting.
The ability to organize.
So I have a related anecdote to this. So I'm doing a project with Pixar Animation Studios down in Emeryville. And I don't know how many, they have hundreds of you know, artists with workstations. And the project involves sort of equipping them with high-end GPUs that suck like 300 blocks or something like that. And I guess the California being what it is, that Pixar only has a certain allocation of power that they can actually use. So it's a consideration for them, like, do we give everybody these high-end cards, or do we actually, you know, go for something that's less powerful computationally, but draws less power, just because they have to sort of stay within a power envelope of the.
That's true for right? That's true for certain data centers as well. It's actually, you know, if you're in a major city, New York, London, probably downtown San Francisco, some other places, you are constrained in terms of how much power the utility can deliver to you within a certain time. And even if not constrained, there's an expense associated with that, upgrading a distribution station or getting a new line in or whatever. So there are often these constraints. So it's not just that company in California. There are data centers all over the place who have this, whether it's a cooling constraint or a direct power constraint.
They're not a data center, right? They're a movie studio.
But they're especially intensive users of computation. So in a way, even though they're not a data center, they're still, you know, probably they went to PG&E and said, "Can you give us more power?" And they said, "Well, if you wait a year and pay us this much money, then."
But by then there'll be a process, a die shrink, and the power consumption will be less.
Well, and that's
then the animation will be
bigger.
Well, so will be a more powerful.
Yeah, so, but what happens in these cases for the data centers is that it actually sparks people to do things that they never thought of before. So, one of my students at the Energy and Resources Group, Jen Mitchell-Jackson, and I, and Jennifer, and Michelle Blazik at AT&T, we did the first peer-reviewed measurements of data center power back in 2001. And we did it in an AT&T facility, and they were power constrained. So we measured, we figured out how much was the power for the servers and different parts of the system, the cooling and everything else. And then 2 years later, there were these other two students from Carnegie Mellon who helped to revisit that facility. And because they were power constrained, they did all this clever stuff because they wanted to put in more computers. So they changed out the lighting, and they removed crack units, and they improved the airflow, and did all these clever things because they needed to in order to deliver the services they wanted to deliver. So I think, in a way, it's it's a constraint, but it also is a prompt for people to innovate and do things that actually make a lot of sense for other reasons.
I mean, our power consumption here at Microsoft must be ridiculous. I mean, you know, I know people that have 2 or 3 machines in their offices and a lot of monitors, leave them on all the time.
Yeah, but you guys are a special case. I think the people who are doing IT services, you're creating software that then is distributed to the hundreds of millions of users around the world, and they're not all they don't all have 3 machines with big LCD screens. So it's you got to think about it in terms of cost per unit shipped, and it's probably not that big.
I'm still intrigued by what Kim said earlier. I mean, because it's making me think of even my camera. Where I used to go on a trip, I'd take 100 pictures. Now, I take thousands.
It's an economics problem. You're racing to the bottom, right? The price is becoming zero, so in essence, things are almost free. They're becoming disposable.
Well, but here's where you start to get this problem of time. Time turns out to be a limiting factor here because your time and attention, I mean, this is something that Herbert Simon talked about years ago. He's a psychologist who I think won the Nobel Prize in economics. He talked about how organizations actually function in the real world as opposed to in the models. But he talked about how time and attention was this limited resource. And we all know it from our personal experience, right? But it really does come to bear when you have 3,000 photos. Do you go through them all to figure out which are the best ones?
That's why I'm pretty
I just know one day I'll get back to it.
So that makes another good point, which is if you do a comparison photo per photo, it's probably way, way better to take a digital photo than an old film photo.
Yeah.
But like Christian says, if he went on holidays when it was a film camera, he might have used 2 rolls of film, 48 photos. Now you might come back with 3,000 or 4,000 photos. So it's not a fair comparison because you're taking 2 orders of magnitude more photos, which you put on a disc, which is spinning, which you never look
And
at
not only
again.
that, my new camera has burst ability, so I can take 10 pictures.
So soon it'll be 10,000 photos.
I never thought of it.
But then we'll invent...
It's a comment.
Yes.
When it comes to benchmarks, the trouble is not getting 10 computer scientists. The trouble is when you get 1 salesman. Or worse, a salesman masquerading as a computer scientist. The witness dries.
Well, that's why I relied on the economist from Yale.
To Christian's point, just as we're doing automatic face tagging now, or face recognition, we'll have automatic what's the best photo detection. So that'll be another way of consuming.
So we continue to make it easier to just over-consume.
It's not just the best. You'll take a bunch of those photos.
Merge them together.
This is the best one you could have taken.
Automatically. Because users have...
And we're working on that heavily, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
So,
you pull up your scatter plot,
sure.
kilowatts.
Do you want the computations per kilowatt hour?
Yeah. From the 40s.
Yes.
Are you still good?
Yeah. I can talk for hours. No problem. You know me. Come on.
Photo taken.
Okay.
I think it's...
We're getting there. We're getting there. This performance.
Which one are you looking at?
I'm just
This one.
looking at it from the 1940s. There you go. That one.
Hold on. Let's get this up here so we get full screen. Okay. Yes.
I'm looking at this, and it's nice and neat, but I'm thinking that I'm a power guy, so the efficiency of energy conversion in the 40s and 50s up into the 60s was sub 50%. So for every watt you consume, you're burning another watt in your power supplies.
Yeah.
From the 60s to the mid-70s, a little bit better than 50, and then switch mode power supplies became more commonplace. Mid-70s, you see a bump there, maybe 5% more. We're seeing another bump now, but I'm not seeing 100% efficient power supply. So I'm wondering if you apply a general rule to this and see if that skews your line.
Okay, so the basic, it's a very interesting question. So there's a more general way to frame it, which is there are components of these systems, and we're looking at the total power use, and we're looking at total computations, but the components of the systems change over time, and in this way you've identified a kind of secular trend in that component. And that's something that I haven't, I don't have data at the power supply level, but it's a great question, because it really...
Well, it would be nearly impossible to gain efficiency numbers for
Yeah, you may not even see it because this is, this growth is so fast. I mean, it's part of it is that this is, this semi-log plot here just wipes out a lot of the, a modest change like that. But I think you're asking an interesting question. It would be great to plot, even in a schematic way, these two lines.
Well, if you look at up to 1960, you got the SDS 920.
Here's 1960, right?
Right, and you go up to the top, and then you got sort of a reset.
This is the discrete transistors here.
Right. Well, the Altair 88's got a switch mode power supply.
Ah, yep.
Okay, so you'll get a correcting factor or an offset factor. And if you're looking forward out 5-10 years, we're reaching the limit because we can't get better than 99% efficient. And we're reaching that in those stages.
So it's really, what you're saying, it could be more of a sawtooth.
Yes,
You could barely see it on the scale. It's a factor of 2 and there's 1 trillion to 1.
Yeah. That's
okay,
right.
but computation.
No, but I think it's still an interesting question. It's something where I think, let me talk to you after the session and let's see if there's a quick way to do this and see how, whether we can even see the difference in the lines. We may. I just don't know.
But everything's to do with that, though. I mean, the transistors are getting more efficient. Everything's getting more
The drives are better.
If you look at it from a system perspective, how much power I pump in versus how much utility computing I get out, then all that stuff gets added in.
Yeah.
So if the current technology in 1960 was a very inefficient power supply, but that was cutting edge at the time.
Okay, but my point is we're getting fundamentally better in efficiency and
Yes,
computation all along the way. We're reaching the point where efficiency is not going to get much better.
Right.
Well, and that's
Yeah.
really true for a lot of this stuff. It's all peaking out. All the efficiency of all these components is starting to get to a
Exactly.
point.
Well, but the driving force is really the processor. Really, I think that's the thing that overwhelms everything else.
Maybe so.
But let's talk about it afterwards, because there might be a way to do this calculation just to see if your instinct is right.
But I think even if you start looking at things today, especially if you start looking at like system-on-a-chip designs that are getting very, very powerful, things like the Wi-Fi radio, when actively transmitting and receiving, overshadow even the processor in some respects. So that might also be tipping as well.
Yeah, and
so
that's
all this low-hanging fruit that we took, like better power supply, like we've exhausted a lot of the easier solutions.
Right, and so that's where it starts. As soon as you start having devices that do a whole lot more transmitting versus computation, it becomes a whole lot more complicated.
Well, and also the idle issue, because you define, how do you define computation? Is computation the typical behavior of a device over a period of time?
Maximum here.
Yeah, I mean, because my phone and my PC and the server have very different use characteristics in terms of how much they can be idle and how efficient they can be in terms of like getting close to zero when they're not actively doing something because they don't need to, right?
Yeah.
And so I struggle with sort of how you represent that, because there's really two forms of improvement that the processor could be making, or the system could be making. Into 0-watt idle when you're doing nothing, and then doing computation more efficient when it's actually doing something.
Yes. Right, and it gets at that whole thing about energy proportional computing that Luis Barroso talks about, which is where we want to be ultimately, so that we're delivering exactly the computation service when we need it and using power only when we're delivering that service.
Yeah, I know of at least one system that I happen to be involved with many years ago that actually consumed the greatest power consumption was when the system was at dead idle.
Really?
Yeah, because when you started doing something, it started...
What system was that?
It's because they wanted to avoid step loads. Power systems.
They wanted to avoid step loads, and they wanted to keep constant temperature of components to maximize the,
Can I talk to you afterwards?
And that they were beneath the needed efficiency curve. So,
But it was interesting. As soon as you started doing anything, power started going down.
Mike Sinclair here took some cell phones, put a budget on their bottom, so most of the time the big 32-bit CPU doesn't even run. There's a reptile brain CPU that just watches, should I wake up the CPU?
Yeah.
the real CPU. And I believe he's getting interesting power.
So he's figured out a way to make it only wake up when it's needed.
But using another CPU.
Yeah, tiny one.
Tiny one.
Yes.
Think of the 8051 sitting in a keyboard on a PC.
Yeah.
Okay.
Smart.
Yeah, Charles.
Other questions? Okay, so you guys have been very patient. I'm happy to hang out for a little while. Christian and I are going to go have some dinner after this, but I can hang out for a few more minutes and chat. I would definitely want to talk more about power supplies, and I want to hear about that computer. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.